includes interviews that we have recorded with Janine Yunus, who is a Palestinian-American lawyer from Washington, D.C. We will also be sharing the recording of an interview with Andrew Feinstein, who is a South African-born activist, author, and an advocate for Palestinian liberation. We will also be engaging in a live conversation with Mukoma wa Ngugi, who is a professor of English now in the US. He is from Kenya, and he and his colleagues have instituted a very important case in the US with regards to the rights of free speech on the Palestinian cause and, of course, anti-war in general. So do look out for that conversation as well. These conversations will be followed by an introduction to the Lawyers for Palestine Pledge, which you will be able to sign on the ILCP's website during the course of next week. And of course, the third and final item of today's event is a screening of the film, The Occupation of the American Mind, a very important film to watch, given developments that we are seeing in the US right now. And that film, of course, by our allies at Media for Education. We're going to kick off today's event, as I mentioned, with a screening and interview. We'll begin with Janine Yunus, who is a Palestinian-American lawyer, sharing her perspective on what is happening in the US and a message of hope at the end. Of course, if you have any comments and questions, please feel free to share them in the chat. You're also welcome to share the Zoom link to this event with your networks, your groups, and your channels, and invite people to join us. Israeli Anti-Apartheid Week is going to be with Janine Yunus. She is a civil rights attorney based in the US. Janine, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to talk about Mahmoud Khalil. Obviously, this is a very big topic, not only in the US, but certainly around the world as well. What are the implications for the right to protest if someone like Mahmoud can just be essentially kidnapped unlawfully, taken away? Nobody knows where he is. He's got a wife looking for him. We're glad to see students and lecturers protesting, but what are the implications for the right to free speech in a country like the US?
Well, the implications are very disturbing, profoundly disturbing, I'd say. I don't know that there's ever been a case like this in the United States, at least not in the last 50 years or so, since sort of the Red Scare. We have the First Amendment, which supposedly protects the freedom of speech, and that encompasses the right to protest as well. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and that's widely been understood to apply to all three branches of government. The framers said Congress because Congress is supposed to be the branch making the laws, but now more and more things are done through executive power, so it's understood to apply to the president as well. The idea that somebody would be snatched from his home, put in ICE detention, away from his U.S. citizen wife, who's also 8 months pregnant, is extremely horrifying. And so the government initially tried to say that he had done something wrong, and made sort of nebulous statements about the way the protests were violent and it, been unlawful, which I think are largely untrue. There may have been some sort of minor crimes committed, like trespass and that kind of thing, but not by him. There was no allegation he had committed those crimes. So it became very clear after a couple of interviews were given by members of the Trump administration that it was just his speech, his pro-Palestine position, and participation in the protests, which are lawful in the United States. And so they have now tried to pivot to saying he lied on his green card application because he didn't mention that he had worked at the UNWRA in Syria. Now, it turns out from the news sources I've read that he was an unpaid intern. I don't know exactly what the question on the green card application is, but my sense is, that could be the kind of thing that you might think, well, it was an unpaid internship, I don't need to put it on there. But what they're doing, obviously, is trying to find a way to get him. And that should be very scary to everybody. Because if the government wants to find something you've done wrong and put you in prison or deport you for that, they can do that. Everybody has made some minor transgression, some little slip up, and especially with non-citizens filling out these voluminous forms, it's quite likely that there's going to be some tiny misstatement or something like that. So if they want to try to get you, then they're making it clear that they can. So I think the outcome here is really important. His case, he has been moved. He was transferred to Louisiana. The judge ordered him to be moved back to New Jersey, and the judge will hear his case. And so far, there's been no decision yet, apart from the transfer order back to New Jersey. But whatever happens is going to be very important for free speech in the future.
Right. Well, certainly the US and most countries around the world are built on a foundation of civil disobedience, the right to be able to protest the actions of your government or governments and corporations anywhere in the world. Romesa Ozderk wrote an op-ed which got her, again, basically rendition, Guantanamo Bay style, off the street, which must have been immensely terrifying for her. What does this mean now for students or people like Romesa who want to live in the US or write op-eds on subjects of their choice? And what might it mean for people who are American, white students? Might they expect to also be picked up and treated the way that Mahmoud and Romesa have been treated?
Yeah, so I would say her detention is almost an escalation from Khalil's. I mean, Khalil's is obviously completely unwarranted too, but she didn't even participate in protests. There's no allegation that she was even tied to other people behaving badly. She just wrote an op-ed or co-authored an op-ed. So it's obvious that that's pure speech. I mean, the message that's being sent, and I would have to give this advice to foreign students: don't come here. Don't come here. We don't, I mean, this is not, what is this? I mean, you're getting kidnapped off the street for co-authoring an op-ed opposing genocide. This is not a free country. And don't spend your money here. Don't spend your time here. It's frankly not safe. And I am worried too about American citizens. I have to admit, I'm an American citizen myself. My dad's Palestinian, but my mom is American citizen, so I'm a natural born citizen, not naturalized. But I got scared last night, and I was like, if they want to come for you, and there's this group, Beitar, you might be aware of, like a Jewish supremacist extremist group, they have it out for me. They've been harassing me. And some of the people, Mahmoud Khalil and apparently this woman, Ozturk, were on their list. And I was like, if they want to like try to find some minor transgression I've done or not even anything I've done, but just claim I've done something, that cops might break down my door in the middle of the night. I mean, I think that's what we're looking at here. And it's really scary. I've never felt this terrified in my own country.
Naturally, I mean, it would really make, well, potentially headlines around the world if an attorney is arrested for exercising the right to free speech in the US. We hope that precedent is not set. But certainly part of what we're doing at the ILCP is launching a Lawyers for Palestine pledge. And that's going to be part of this event that you are participating in today. Let's talk about the case at Columbia filed by Jewish students who feel threatened by pro-Palestine, anti-war protest and advocacy on campus. What are the merits of their case, if any, and what do you think the outcome will be?
I think the case is extremely frivolous at best. They've tried to do in the lawsuit is say that the students at Columbia are arms of Hamas, and which is sort of an allegation that many politicians have made without any proof. And this is, of course, designed to try to paint a picture of these people as actual terrorists carrying out the bidding of Hamas, not as peaceful protesters or even, kind of slightly, they don't always have to be completely peaceful. Sometimes they get a little energetic or whatever, but to try to paint this picture that they're actual terrorists doing the bidding of Hamas. And that's, of course, very important to the mission of trying to discredit the protesters and their cause and to tamp down on them. So they've taken it to a new level now. And from my reading of the lawsuit, their proof that the protesters at Columbia are tied to Hamas comes mainly from the fact that apparently Students for Justice in Palestine, which I think Mahmoud Khalil is a part of, had posted on October 6th, "We're back," like for the fall semester, and scheduled their first meeting. So they're trying to argue that the "we're back" shows that they knew October 7th was coming, which is completely ludicrous. I mean, the idea that a student group at Columbia knew that October 7th was coming, and the proof of it is an Instagram post saying "we're back for the semester." It's like laughable. So the students who are suing, and actually they're not all students, some of them are just New Yorkers, they're saying that they were caused pain and suffering by the events of October 7th. One woman actually had members of her family kidnapped and killed. Very sad. But she's trying to claim that the students at Columbia are responsible for that because they are basically arms of Hamas. And the other plaintiffs, their claims are actually ludicrous about the pain and suffering they've endured. One claims that he's a dual citizen, Israeli American, and he was a reservist in the IDF. So because of October 7th, he was forced to be deployed to Gaza, where he had to kill people, and that caused him emotional distress. Of course, it's not framed that way. It's saying he had to be involved in the war in Gaza, and so that caused him emotional distress. Another didn't even go to Gaza herself. It was her brother was sent to Gaza, and she's claiming emotional distress from him being there, even though he's perfectly fine physically. And that is somehow the fault of students at Columbia, including Mahmoud Khalil, and also a woman named Nordine Kiswani, who's been a target of a lot of these Jewish extremist groups.
Well, certainly there are going to be huge implications in terms of free speech and the right to protest
Yeah.
for Americans themselves beyond Palestine. And I hope that Americans realize the era in which we are rapidly entering. Certainly, we saw much of that during the COVID-19 lockdown. Let's turn to talk about international law, Janine. There is a perspective, a growing sentiment that Palestine proves international law doesn't actually exist. Now, this also has implications for us living in Africa, where Israel is involved in the blood diamond trade in the DRC, is building military bases in Somaliland, and of course, is engaged in some sort of psyop warfare against South Africa for our case at the International Court of Justice. Does international law exist? Can it protect us?
That's a very complicated question. And I'll say this with the caveat, I'm not an international law expert. I'm a First Amendment expert, but I would say at this point, no. And I think that's why, lots of us, including myself, can't really sleep at night, because I think what this has proven is that international law is just an illusion. It's to protect the powerful, really. It's wielded by Western powers when it suits them, and then it's completely trampled upon when they're the one when Western powers are the ones who've committed the human rights violations. And here that includes Israel and the United States, since the United States is basically enabling the genocide through financial and moral support. And when the United States is doing that and then also oppressing and persecuting the people who are protesting it, I think it's very obvious that there's no semblance of international law. The only silver lining I see is that there are new powers emerging in the world, mainly from the global south, who are picking up the mantle. I'm extremely, I really admire the group of 9 countries. I forgot what it's called now.
Group, yeah.
Hague 9.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that have gotten together and said, like, we're not going to let this happen. And we need other countries to start to step up. And I think that if they do so, then maybe some of the power that the West wields and the sort of soft moral power will be transferred to them. And that might be a good thing, because clearly America has just been a source for a lot of evil when it comes to international issues.
Right. I've got one last question for you in this rapid fire exchange, and it brings me to the words of Susan Abulhawa, a prolific writer also to be found on X. And it was really quite a powerful statement that she made. She says, Palestine is the only portal to the future. Everyone must pass through it with the choice that will determine the fate of humanity. If the majority go the way of genocidal Zionist colonialism, then that's the world you will get on much larger scales. Go the way of justice and indigenous Palestinian liberation, then humanity might have a chance at a better, gentler, and more just world for us all. Janine, given the fact that corporations benefit from essential colonialism, the fact that imperialism continues even to date, what is your message of hope for Palestinians and people around the world?
I do think that the silent majority is in agreement and is disturbed by the Palestinian suffering. I think sometimes it doesn't become obvious because people are so afraid to speak out for reasons that I think are now clear. It used to be the case that it was very difficult to succeed in many careers if you spoke out on behalf of Palestinian rights. And so, I mean, I myself remained silent for a long time because I was a lawyer. So when things were quiet-ish, I know it's never really quiet for the people of West Bank and Gaza, I didn't say much, but of course things became so awful, I felt I had to speak out. So I understand why a lot of people don't say things privately. A lot of people, even people whose names you might recognize, have said things to me like, thank you for what you're doing. I can't in my position, but I completely agree with you. So I think that there's more empathy than meets the eye, and a lot of people are actually not okay with this. They just don't know what to do. I can't say how heartbroken I am that people aren't willing to risk more, because this is really the worst thing that I've ever seen in my lifetime. I mean, of course, there are horrific genocides frequently, but the fact that it's being enabled by my government and that the people who are calling it out are the ones who are being oppressed and thrown in detention, I think goes farther than anything I ever imagined I could see. And people around me are cheering it on and calling for more babies to be killed, people I know. So it's horrible, but I think there are a lot of good people who are not okay with it. And in the end, I do think that justice will prevail. It just might take some time.
Thank you, Janine, for joining us on the ILCP's Israel Apartheid Week event. Free Palestine, free the world.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our interview and conversation with Palestinian-American lawyer Janine Younes there, a civil rights law specialist, and you can find her on X. Certainly a very interesting, informative, and empowering interview, raising very real concerns for the right to free speech, the right to protest, the right to organize. And we hope that you will continue sharing the link to join today's Zoom, but also when this event is released on our various platforms, please do share it widely. Next up, we will be watching an interview with Andrew Feinstein. As I mentioned earlier, Andrew is an activist, an author of the book Shadow World, very important book to read, and also an anti-Zionist, pro-Palestine advocate. So we're going to watch this interview, and then we'll be engaging in conversation with author, Cornell University professor, and the founder of a very important Kiswahili prize, Mukoma wa Ngugi. Let's have a look at this conversation with Andrew Feinstein. Of course, if you have any comments or questions, you're welcome to share them in the chat. Our next interview is part of the Israeli Apartheid Week event hosted by the International Legal Coalition for Palestine is with Andrew Feinstein, who is an author, an activist, and a former MP in the ANC government led by Nelson Mandela. Thank you very much for joining us today, Andrew.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
So I want to start with apartheid. That's the theme of today's event, right? Apartheid, imperialism, and free speech. I find that in interactions, even with African people, they're not really aware of why South Africa compares our experience of apartheid with the Palestinian experience of apartheid. What would you say to Africans on this particular subject?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that the roots of apartheid in South Africa was European settler colonialism, when people from Holland, from France, then from Britain decided that what we now know as South Africa was a land with no people. Weirdly, I was taught at school under apartheid in South Africa that they then had to fight all sorts of wars against the indigenous people. So there were both no people there, but there were a whole lot of people they had to fight wars against. So the roots are settler colonialism. And at its heart, apartheid is about racist white supremacy. That is South Africa. That was South Africa under apartheid. That is Israel. Israel is a European settler colonial project. They decided that Palestine was a land with no people for a people with no land. In other words, the Jewish people. Because Zionists, people who believe that there should be a Jewish state, are under the mistaken impression that they speak for all Jews. But just like in apartheid South Africa, the settler colonialism of the state of Israel is built on racist white supremacy. It is based on the belief that white Europeans are somehow superior and have the right to do what they want to do to whomsoever they want to do it. So the roots are absolutely identical. And the bottom line of existence under an apartheid state is that depending on the color of your skin, on your ethnicity, in the case of Palestine and Israel, your nationality, you are treated differently under the law. And that is how apartheid is defined in what is called the Rome Statute of International Law. So the commonalities are profound, except that both Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who understood apartheid in South Africa far better than I ever could, because I grew up as a privileged white person under apartheid, they described apartheid in Israel and Palestine as far more brutal and far worse than apartheid in South Africa for one very simple reason. In South Africa, the apartheid state was entirely dependent on the black workforce to mine our natural resources that are the source of wealth for our country, whereas Israel is not dependent on the Palestinian population for its economic well-being. So Israel is prepared to treat Palestinians more brutally, to kill them in far greater numbers than the apartheid state in South Africa was prepared to do.
This is a very important explanation for our African audiences. Regardless of Mandela's very famous quote that, South Africa is not free until Palestine is free, there are still some very serious and warring relationships between South Africa and the apartheid state of Israel. That includes both economic and diplomatic ties. Some may say, therefore, that South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice is hypocritical in some instances.
Look, I think it was incredibly important that it was South Africa that brought the case to the ICJ. As a country that has overcome a system of apartheid, that can speak to anti-racism like few can, it was extremely important. And symbolically, seeing lawyers from across the spectrum of South African society, of a democratic South African society, notwithstanding the fact that our democracy has massive challenges in South Africa, that was incredibly important. But of course, like everything in politics, there is hypocrisy. And the reality is that while the ANC as a government has been quite good generally on matters of foreign policy, has stood up, for instance, to the United States on occasion, to states like Israel and others, and Nelson Mandela, before he was president, famously said in an American interview, our friends are not necessarily your friends, and our enemies are not necessarily your enemies. But at the same time, of course, the South African state is trying to play something of a double game. We'll bring this case to the ICJ, but we're not going to cut off diplomatic and economic relationships. The irony of that is, as the leaders of the liberation movement in South Africa, the ANC demanded that other countries break off diplomatic, economic, sporting, and cultural relationships with apartheid South Africa. So the fact that we haven't done that in totality with Israel is a failure, and it's a failing of the legacy of our struggle, and it's a failing of our role on the world stage in opposing the existing form of legalized apartheid that exists in Israel-Palestine.
Sobering words there. Let's turn now our attention to the role of Jewish people, anti-Zionist Jews like yourself, and Jewish people in Palestine and around the world, who are increasingly, in a much louder voice, saying, "Not in my name." They're being persecuted for this, much like the students at Columbia. What do you think would be the emerging role or the defining role of these Jewish people in helping to ensure that Palestine is one day free?
First of all, I don't want to make a sort of a case for Jewish exceptionalism here. The fact that there are Jews who are opposed to the state of Israel, who are opposed, might not even be anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, but who are opposed to many actions of the Jewish state, of the state of Israel, is important, obviously, for symbolic reasons, for political reasons. But at the same time, let's not exceptionalize Jews in the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Having said that, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, as a Jew, my mother taught me that never again is never again for all humanity. So I regard my role in anti-racist struggles, in the Palestinian struggle, as being because I'm a Jew, not in spite of being a Jew. And I think that's really important. I think it's also important to point out when people suggest that Israel represents all Jews and that all Jews uncritically support Israel, not only is that factually untrue, it's actually deeply racist and anti-Semitic. This idea that all Jews think in the same way is an absolute nonsense. No community has that. You know, any community, just like the Jewish community, any community anywhere is going to have a very broad diversity of views. So we mustn't fall into those sort of traps either. But I think the fact that there are Jews, and an ever-increasing number, as you say, and some very influential Jewish people around the world, who are realizing that the entire Zionist project of the State of Israel is actually a racist settler colonial project, and at the moment is perhaps the most barbaric state on the planet in terms of what it is doing to the people of Gaza, the people of the West Bank, and even people in Lebanon, I think, of course, does have a symbolic importance. But we should never elevate that above the role of Palestinians themselves, because it is the resilience and tenacity of the Palestinian people that will ultimately lead to their liberation, just as it was the extraordinary courage and resilience of millions of ordinary South Africans who, through wave after wave of industrial strike, through making townships ungovernable, with the support of tens of millions around the world in what we now know as BDS campaigns, that's how we liberated South Africa. And that's how Palestine will be liberated. And just as in the case of South Africa, there were white South Africans who were opposed to the apartheid state, we shouldn't be surprised that there are Jews, both in Israel and around the world, opposed to the actions of the Israeli government, and in many instances opposed to the nature of the Jewish state itself.
Powerfully captured. Let's talk now about the Dignity Declaration. I saw this posted on your X, and it certainly got my attention vis-a-vis the fact that components from UK are being used to build F-35s, right? This is absolutely happening. So, of course, the UK government and by extension, taxpayers are paying for the genocide in Palestine and other parts of the world through the lens of your work in the book Shadow World, which, of course, it reminds me of Anthony Lewinstein's book, The Palestine Laboratory. Both your books expose and challenge the role of the profiteers, the military-industrial complex. So what then is the role of this Dignity Declaration, and how can it be supported?
So we have a situation in the United Kingdom, like we do across most of the global north, the United States and Europe, etc., where our governments are supporting the Israeli state in whatever it wants to do. There is no number of Palestinian children, women, and men that Israel can kill that will lead to any sort of negative reaction from the West at this point. But the West is arming the genocide and is profiting from the genocide. And how it profits from the genocide is through the arms trade, which is the most corrupt business in the world. It accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade. And a significant amount of that money goes into financing our politics and our individual politicians. Now, we experienced that in South Africa through what notoriously became known as the South African arms deal, which was how I first started doing this work, because I was an MP at the time and tried to actually investigate it in Parliament and was stopped from doing so by Thabo Mbeki, our then president. The role of the arms trade in effectively financing, oiling the wheels of our political systems is really a representation of how the intermixing of money and politics, business and politics, is destroying our world. So that in the West, we live in what we describe as the best democracies money can buy. And what those democracies, so-called, are doing at the moment, in addition to supporting a genocide, they are slashing benefits, they are slashing investment in healthcare, they are making their countries stratospherically more unequal. Britain today has more billionaires than at any time in our history, but there are more families requiring food banks to feed themselves than at any time since the end of the Second World War. Those two things should not coexist in a vaguely civilized society. So, for instance, in Britain, where I live, my local MP, who happens to be a guy called Keir Starmer, has announced increases in defence spending of almost £13.5 billion a year. And that's going to increase even more from 2030, while announcing cuts of 7 billion or cost-cutting measures in the National Health Service, cutting 7 billion pounds of cuts, 6 billion pounds of cuts to welfare benefits. And their entire growth strategy is built on increasing defence spending. The EU is planning to spend an additional 800 billion euros on defence. And they're using the Ukraine war and the threat of Russia to justify this. This extra expenditure will have no impact on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because it'll take 3 to 7 years before anything manifests out of this increased spending. This is simply a way to continue to increase the flow of money in our political process and to ensure that what we call the global national security elite, the corporate executives, the politicians, the law and auditing firms, the consulting firms who benefit from the defense companies, and the media, who are effectively their propaganda arm, that they all benefit further. And the people who suffer the consequences of that are ordinary citizens, because there is a massive opportunity cost to this increased defense spending. It means we're not tackling the real threats facing us, the climate catastrophe, inequality, as I mentioned, the failure of our healthcare systems, of our benefit systems, etc., etc., etc. We are effectively creating a society for oligarchs in the image of oligarchs. And it's tragic to have to say that at the top of that pile of odious oligarchs sits a racist white South African called Elon Musk, who had the audacity, the disgusting arrogance to make a Nazi salute. And in case we weren't clear that he had made a Nazi salute, 2 days later, he gave the keynote address at the far, far right German political party that is effectively fascist and neo-Nazi. So these are the people who are effectively controlling the world today. And the arms trade and the defense industry is a crucial way through which they exercise and monetize that control.
Very compelling points shared with us during this conversation. So grateful to have invited you to it, Andrew. Closing message. You know, people like Julian Assange and others have done very important work in exposing the oligarchy, the technocrats, the military-industrial complex. And he, amongst others, have expressed this view that the war is not meant to be won. The war is meant to be endless. Despite that, we are seeing young people in every part of the world taking a stand against these endless wars, not only because they decimate humanity and children in particular, but because the economics of war means that they will have no future. What is your message as a former South African now living in the UK as a citizen of the world? What is your message to young people in 2025?
The first thing to say is I am and always will be a South African. It's the only citizenship I hold. It doesn't matter where in the world I live because of the work that I do at a global level. The second thing to say is, you know, in the interregnum, a whole variety of morbid symptoms of that we're in our world today. The reality is, people of my sort of generation, people of the privilege that I come from as a white South African who grew up under apartheid, we have messed up. The world currently is a catastrophe. We are watching a genocide live screened to our devices every day. So unlike the Holocaust, that my mother was a survivor of but lost dozens of her family in, nobody can claim they didn't know what Israel was doing in Gaza, because we can all see it on our screens every day. And in the West, our governments do absolutely nothing about it against the will of the majority of their people. So we need to accept, first of all, that what neoliberal capitalism has created is an unmitigated disaster for humanity. But it is up to the younger generation to reconceive and reconceptualize our world, to change our political systems, which have clearly failed us. The only people they benefit are the politicians and their billionaire and corporate donors. That's it. The rest of us suffer the consequences, some far worse than others. But I have absolutely no doubt that younger generations who are showing themselves in various forms of resistance to the status quo, that they have the intelligence, the tenacity, and the commitment to change our world for the better. And that's what we managed to do in South Africa. And despite the fact that our democracy has so many challenges, we must never forget that we overcame over 340 plus years of racist oligarchy. And one of the ways in which we did that was because we actually took the attitude that Nelson Mandela emerged from Robben Island with. And when he was asked how he had hope during those long years on the island, he said, because of our people, because of their tenacity and resilience, I know that it is only impossible until we do it.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Andrew Feinstein, for joining us today in the ILCP's Anti-Apartheid Week event, Free Palestine, Free the World.
Thank you so much.
An outstanding conversation there with Andrew Feinstein. I would certainly encourage you to follow him on X and read his book, Shadow World. We also highlighted the work of Anthony Lowenstein in his book, The Palestine Laboratory, which highlights the insidious and diabolical weapons, many of these new and experimental, being tested on terrorized Palestinians, and of course, most likely will be used in other parts of the world as well. If you've just joined us during this ILCP Israeli Apartheid Week event, welcome and thank you very much. We will now be introducing into conversation Mukoma wa Ngugi, and I'm going to ask our host to bring him into conversation. Welcome, Mukoma. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you in person. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for the invitation and for already the very interesting conversations that have taken place so far.
Very grateful. I say in person, I guess that it's because we relate to each other as Africans who are fighting for a better world, wherever in the world we might be located. When I asked earlier, when you just arrived, about the turbulence in the US, you mentioned that it was a quiet kind of turbulence. How would you explain that better to us?
Well, so I was thinking more in terms of the case that we filed against Donald Trump. This is me, Momodou Tal, and Shriram. Because it's coming in waves, so now we're in holding pattern, but of course it's not holding pattern because anything can happen in the meantime. For example, there's a lot of worry about whether ICE will. Is that my screen? Anyway,
No. We're just trying to share a poster with Momadou's on it. I think we can stop sharing that one.
All right. Yes. So sorry, I lost my train of thought. But so we filed a lawsuit. There's been a lot of back and forth. Our last filing was denied by the judge. In other words, we have been filing the lawsuit on First Amendment rights and freedom of expression and so on and so forth. So, but the judge had the question of jurisdiction, right? Because what happened was the Trump administration is claiming to have revoked Momodu's visa a day before we filed the lawsuit. So now, if he's not legally here, then this is as per the judge. So if already his visa has been revoked, then it's not her jurisdiction. But then we filed another brief yesterday. So that's what I mean. Like, so we are just waiting right now. Now we have to wait for the judge to look at that, and then for the Trump administration to reply, and then So it's just waiting. It's just this period of just waiting. Yeah. So a quiet turbulence. Yeah.
That I understand. So I'm looking at a poster which is titled Solidarity with Mamadou Tal, and it explains the Trump administration is targeting him. He's a Cornell PhD student, outspoken opponent of the Gaza genocide, for daring to sue to repeal Trump's executive orders criminalizing speech. Now he faces intimidation, detention, and possible deportation, a clear attack on Palestine solidarity and political dissent. And he says, I will not be intimidated. Am I worried at times? Of course. Am I stressed beyond anything I've experienced before? Most definitely. But I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent. There is no point in living in a world where hundreds of children are slaughtered daily. I watched a little clip on your X. I think you were outside the court expressing similar views, the impact on the right to free speech, but also emphasizing this is genocide, this is genocide, this is genocide, and that's why we need to speak up. And of course, with regards to this case, as you shared, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of New York denied your initial motion for a temporary restraining order in Mamadou Tal versus Donald Trump. You filed an amended complaint, a petition for a writ of habeas corpus to prevent his detention. The court asked for a further briefing, and in the meantime, the legality of his detention has not yet been decided by the court. We will keep everyone updated. But as you've just shared with us now, there certainly are further developments. You know, you mentioned in that little clip of you outside the courthouse that you come from Kenya, where you've experienced authoritarianism and a clamp on the right to free speech. And now you're experiencing the same in the US. Of course, it's a lot colder in the US than it is in Kenya. Share with us those thoughts when you compare and you parallel these experiences. Are these governments really that different?
Yeah, so what happened was I was in Kenya in January, just this past January, right? And I was in Kenya at the time when the current government, President Ruto's government, is abducting young people for speaking out, really, right? But so in Kenya there's a growing authoritarian government that's that's practicing really. But I grew up under Kenyatta, and our first president Kenyatta, who detained my father. My father is Goyowadiama, who detained him without trial. And then under the Moi dictatorship, where now my father ended up getting exiled, right? So, but the whole idea of being in Kenya, where there's a lot of fear about getting activists getting abducted and disappeared, and then to immediately come to the US, where some of my students have been suspended for free speech, where they're living in fear, where you can see a growing authoritarian government also practicing. I don't know. I don't know. I'm still trying to find a way of expressing it poetically, right? Because it's almost it's almost surreal, right? When I was growing up in Kenya in the 1990s, Moi, the dictator Moi, would come and abduct students, and kill some of them, and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much what we're seeing here. But the thing that unites both Kenya and the US for me is the idea of fear, right? The idea of fear, because it's fear that creates silence. And I think most dictatorial governments know that you create fear, so people are very unsure of what they can say, whom they can talk to. Because logically, a government cannot lock up, I don't know, 360 million people, right? But you can make each person feel the fear of they might be next. So for me, the thing that's tying both countries together, both Kenya and the US, is just watching this growing fear. For example, one of the questions I ask is, okay, why? Okay, so let's say you're a professor at Cornell, or Columbia or Yale or elsewhere, right? Where you have full tenure, you're a full professor. Like why, like what is it? Okay, okay. Of course, we know tenure can be taken away, but what is it? What is it about this fear that make a person who otherwise has nothing to fear feel very afraid to speak out about Palestine or about other injustices and so on and so forth? So I would say the common thread is fear.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that very important topic with us. Currently, Mokoma, we are seeing, perhaps for a while now, Israeli influence and chaos on the African continent in ways that most Africans are completely unaware of. That includes the DRC and Israeli billionaires' greed for what we call blood diamonds, which precipitates and leads to the chaos we're seeing in that genocide in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Mhm.
Israel's also trying to build military bases in the Horn of Africa, in Somaliland. And at the same time, we see the US government targeting South Africa using spurious reasons from our own land challenge issues to distorting what is happening with our farmers here in South Africa, but ultimately to punish South Africa for the case that it filed at the International Court of Justice. So this chaos that Israel is implementing includes the Western Cape in South Africa, which is one of our 9 provinces, that the proponents to separate the Western Cape from the rest, or Cape Town from the rest of the country, openly admit that it would be a homeland for Jewish people. And we know originally the plan was for the Jewish people who escaped persecution and Holocaust in Europe was to move to Africa, to Uganda in particular. How important is it for Africans to understand the implications of what Israel is doing on the continent and what it can do if it gains a stronger foothold in Africa?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, I have to say I haven't followed Israel's actions in South Africa and so on and so forth, right? But there's a general principle that I think all African governments should pay attention to, which is don't let imperial forces into your country. It seems so obvious, right? So, for example, maybe the principle will be not to allow militarization of other countries' foreign policy, right? In other words, we shouldn't be there for other countries' national interest and so on and so forth, right? So now we know. So I would say I would oppose such moves on the same basis that I oppose the African Command Center by the US. We know the war on terror by the US has it's been nothing but a cover for further exploitation. All right, the DRC is very personal to me because, okay, we talk about if you count from 1995 or thereabouts, over 6 million people have died in the Congo, right? And the one thing that has never stopped, even amongst all this death and chaos and wars, is the flow of diamonds or the flow of natural resources and so on and so forth. I think there's something to be said about not allowing, I don't know, not opening up Africa for exploitation. All right, so that's one. I mean, the other one that's personal to me is the issue of land leasing, where you have the US and other foreign countries land leasing, to the detriment of our farmers, right? You can talk about the African Growth Opportunity Act and so on and so forth. So, but what I do hope, though, in spite of having very little hope in our current African leadership, is that at least they will wake up to an extent where they say, why, for example, why the hell does South Africa need US aid money? Right? You know what I mean? Like why are South Africans in need of US aid money to an extent where now people might die from not having access to AIDS medicine and so on and so forth, whereas South Africa is one of the richest countries in the world. I like a lot what Feinstein said in terms of, okay, sure, we can applaud South Africa bringing Israel in front of the ICJ, but at the same time, we should be able to call out some of those contradictions. But at any rate, I hope now that the US is sort of it's actually, in my opinion, it's actually imploding, right? It's imploding, but it's going to implode very, very loudly, which is okay, a contradiction of terms. But now that it's imploding, I hope now African countries will wake up and just ask, like, why do we need the US? Why do we need US aid? You know, and US aid money anyway itself was a tool for American foreign policy. So I would say the principle should be sovereignty, control of our resources. I do think there are some things we really need, like land redistribution. Okay, so the whole thing of Elon Musk and the white farmers in South Africa. I mean, it would be a joke actually, right? You know, ordinarily that would be really funny. You know, the U.S. offering asylum to white South African farmers, right? Except it's coming at great cost.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for raising the subject of US aid. And I couldn't agree with you any more on the sovereignty of the African continent and countries around the world. Now, some of the criteria that has been set up by the US administration to identify dissidents, let's call them that, is evidence that an applicant advocates for a terrorist activity or otherwise demonstrates a degree of public approval or public advocacy for terrorist activities or a terrorist organization. This may be evident in conduct that bears a hostile attitude towards US citizens or US culture, including government, institutions, or founding principles. How are people going to organize against their governments if this kind of precedent that is being set by the US administration becomes a precedent around the world? Because the right to free speech, the right to protest, the right to civil disobedience, all of this is going to be weakened and diluted to the extent that perhaps countries in the North and the West are not where people want to live. Perhaps we're going to see a mass migration of freedom-loving people in the North and the West to the East and the South. What are your thoughts on this potential phenomenon?
Yeah, so I would say one of the scariest things has been the executive orders from Trump, right? Because it's a blanket justification to put anybody in jail or to revoke visa or punish in one way or another, simply because they're expressing views about Palestine. It could be about race, it could be about gender, it could be about sexuality, and so on and so forth. So in short, what Trump is setting up is to have a draconian state where anybody can be picked up for anything. I think the first guest was talking about that. The whole idea that under this executive order, so what is it? You know, you're walking down the street, you know, did you jaywalk? You know, did you jaywalk? Did you have your papers on you? Even the whole idea now that they'll be asking immigrants over 18 years old to carry their papers, right? Doesn't that sound like the past? In Kenya also, we had a similar thing under colonialism. But what they have done then is to set up these executive orders, and that then under them they can do anything, you know. So part of the argument against Momodu now is that the executive order has been issued, so now it's within the right of ICE or State Department and so on and so forth to revoke his visa, because it's almost like they have created their own little question and answer, right? You know, where okay, so we have created this law. The law should be illegal, but anyway, it's an executive order. So if you don't follow it, then you are doing something illegal. The closest thing I've been able to think of is, for example, telling people, okay, you shouldn't wear shoes. That's the law, and then you go around arresting people because they are wearing shoes. So I do think we should be extremely concerned. All right. So okay, was the U.S. Was the US Kenya? Actually, let me put it that way. I wouldn't worry so much, right? You know, because it's Kenya, you know, maybe it would destabilize Eastern Africa, well, and a bit of the region, right? But this is the US, it's nuclear armed, you know, the potential for doom is extremely high, right? So yeah, and what Feinstein said about oligarchs. Now, yeah, essentially we are creating a world economy that's meant to sustain the oligarchs who also have a contempt, right? Because at some level you have to think of it as contempt. They have a contempt for people. All right. Okay. So the executive order, for me, is very simple, actually, right? All right. You just look at the numbers, right? It's 50,000. 50,000. It could be more depending on what numbers you use, but let's stay with 50,000 Palestinians dead. The whole of Gaza devastated. No universities, hospitals. In the last few days, I don't know, 700-800 have been killed, and so on and so forth. So we're watching this genocide happen. But it's been enabled by people like Trump and executive orders. One can only hope that other countries are not learning from Trump, though there's an argument to be made that the Kenyan growing dictatorship, where they used a playbook from Trump, so Trump was America first. Then in Kenya, it was Kenya first, right? The whole idea of passing taxes on to the people. Yeah, so there are ways in which they are learning, but I don't know. I think we can only hope that the people themselves, at some point, will get pushed to a point where there is no choice but to resist. Then now that would raise the question of the nature of that resistance. But what Trump is doing, I think everybody should be really worried. And okay, during the part of my talk at outside the court 2 days ago, I said, okay, the whole idea behind the First Amendment speech, okay, so yeah, you shouldn't yell fire in a movie theater, right? Especially if there's no fire, right? Because then you just create mayhem. But I was saying this is the time to yell fire now. Like we have to yell, there's a fire burning here, there's a fire burning in Palestine, a fire burning in Sudan, in Congo, and so on and so forth.
Brilliant response. Thank you very much, Mukoma. I've got 2 more questions for you. And then if any of our participants have any questions they'd like to ask, please feel free to pop them into the chat section. I'm looking at this directive to Columbia University, Mukoma, which includes a directive on the MISAS department, putting it under academic receivership. And it says, begin the process of placing the Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies Department under academic receivership for a minimum of 5 years. The university must provide a full plan with date, certain deliverables by March 20th, 2025. This is one of the conditions to, of course, restoring that astronomical amount of taxpayer funding that's been given to Columbia University. And we know that Columbia has essentially folded. Now, one of your accolades, apart from being a prolific author, a professor at Cornell of English, is the founder of a Kiswahili Prize. So when you hear that these kind of measures are being taken to undermine and to essentially decimate studies in these areas, the languages, the culture, the history, the heritage, how do you feel? And how do you think people should be responding? Are we going to see a brain drain where students from those communities are going to say, no, we're not going to Columbia? I'm certainly seeing evidence of that on X, where people are posting their responses to an invite and saying, no, thank you, we'll go somewhere else.
Yeah, so the first thing would be, if you're coming from the global south to come do work in an American university or to give a lecture, you're better off doing it in Kenya or South Africa, really, because first, that's where the knowledge is needed. Okay, not to say that knowledge isn't needed here, but given the hassle of getting the visa, then also will you be allowed to come? What will you be allowed to say? Are you okay, let's say you come and say something off the cuff about Palestine. Do you get kicked out, and so on and so forth? I think Colombia agreeing to Trump's demands is criminal, actually. Right? I think for a university, because this is part of the playbooks from dictators, right? So going back in South Africa as well during apartheid, of course, they went after the students, they went after the universities. In Kenya, they did the same thing. But I think for a university to agree to have a government come in and have an oversight over a department, I think for a university to agree to that, that's criminal, actually. And in any case, it did not. So Colombia capitulated fast, right? They agreed fast, but Trump still came after them, right? Because Trump, okay, so for Trump, it's not so much about a question. Okay, quite frankly, I don't think it's a question of Palestine for Trump. I think Palestine is an excuse to try and diminish and to use the terms they use to degrade, to degrade higher education. So I think as scholars, we should be very, very worried. All right, so I've been asking myself the question, okay, why did I join the lawsuit, right? And part of it for me is because in 2001, after the 9/11, World Trade Center and all the people that died and so on and so forth, that's when the United States started becoming very, very draconian, even though we know part of it for me now is it's just that the facade of democracy has been removed because, okay, for whom has the US been democratic for anyway? But anyway, at that point, I was doing my PhD at UW-Madison, and I'll be in class, I was doing post-colonial studies. So I'm in class learning about Frantz Fanon, and all these revolutionary thinkers. So somebody's teaching, or the professor is teaching, and an official from, I don't know, from the police in Milwaukee would come in with a list, and they will pull out the Muslim students, to go for what they were calling processing in Milwaukee. Right. So I'm in class, but then the professor would just continue talking as if nothing has happened. So without seeing the disjuncture between here we are talking about post-colonial studies, here we are talking about Fanon, your students are being pulled out of class and yet not saying anything, right? So for me, that's something I couldn't, that's something I can't live with. I can't live with the idea of, anyway, professionally anyway, with the idea that I'm in class and a student of mine cannot attend because they attended or spoke about a genocide. I mean, it's part of it is just ridiculous, right? So we are punishing the people who are speaking against a genocide in a university with full compliance from universities, from university officials who themselves are academics. I mean, it's almost like a farce, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think it provides very important insight to people around the world on this particular subject of academic freedom.
Yeah, but can I
also,
yeah, so
please go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the now scholars and intellectuals and writers finding other homes outside the US, I think that's already happening, right? But part of it is also questioning the hegemony of US academia, right? So now, like there's an African Studies Association, okay, fine, of Africa, right? In response to the ASA here, I think the African Literature Association is holding its meeting in Nairobi. So I think the shift is happening. Then okay, now I feel like I need to say everything. Okay, but this is my working theory, right? And I'm not an economist, but I think I think the US is broke, right? I think financially it's not doing well. And part of it would be to look at who owns most of the US debt. It's China, Japan, and so on and so forth, right? At the same time, because of what they did with NAFTA, the free trade agreement, even the idea of tariffs is silly because most of the car parts, what we call car manufacturing in the US is actually bringing in parts so they can be assembled. So I think what's happening now, they're trying to do cost saving measures, but also using culture as a divisive force.
Yes. And certainly the economic impacts of these decisions will be felt for a very long time. We know that Trump has also made comments around BRICS, and we'll have to see whether BRICS becomes an important balance to US and its allies' hegemony around the world. We've got a question for you, Mukoma. What do you think can be done in Kenya to support legal justice, specifically the Palestinian cause? Are there any possible ways of approaching that subject?
Oh yeah, so for me actually, so being in Kenya and being in the US is literally like being in the same country but different in so many ways, right? So in the US, a talk around Palestine is being stifled. But in Kenya, when I was there last year as well, I went to visit this slum, it's called Kariobangi. A slum as a slum does, as we understand slums, but yet the artists from that slum were doing a mural, a proper Palestinian mural, right? So what's in the US, the US has always been myopic, right? It's always been myopic. It doesn't see outside and so on and so forth. But I think the rest of the world can see what's happening, and it's a genocide. And there's a lot of support. Now, the question becomes, okay, you have popular support for Palestine, right? But okay, but what do we expect from a government that's also abducting its own, in Kenya, they're called Gen Zs, the younger activists. And what do we do? Going back to the contradiction Feinstein was raising earlier in terms of South Africa. So, but what do we do then with, let's say, the Kenyan government? The Kenyan government, for example, sent police in Haiti, right? To go and stabilize Haiti, even though Haiti was the first independent Black nation in the world because of the Haitian Revolution and so on and so forth. So what do we do with the contradictions then if this support is coming from, I don't know, questionable, contradictory sources? But I do think amongst Kenyan people themselves, the support for Palestine is palpable.
So there certainly are opportunities for engagement and the strengthening of that relationship. And I find it so interesting that it's, there's the poor and the working class as always, and the mural. So in other words, connecting human rights through the arts. I often say the arts is more powerful than politics could ever be. So thank you very much for that response. One last question for you before we move on to the next part of our program. And that is, I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes from Arundhati Roy. I'm sure you're very familiar with her, writer, activist, etc. And she says, our strategy should not only be to confront empire, but to lay siege to it, to deprive it of oxygen, to shame it, to mock it with our art, our music, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our sheer relentlessness, and our ability to tell our own stories, stories that are different from the ones we've been brainwashed to believe. The corporate revolution will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. So there's BDS right there. Their ideas, their version of history, their wars, their weapons, their notion of inevitability. Remember this, we be many and they be few. They need us more than we need them. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Mamadou, Mokoma, what is your message to people who are standing against neocolonialism, imperialism, apartheid, and censorship around the world?
That we are not alone, and I say that because after the courthouse, after we did the hearing on Tuesday, there were about 200 supporters outside, right? And from all sorts of different political, social backgrounds. For example, there was a guy who works with undocumented workers. You have people who are the Jewish Coalition for Peace and so on and so forth. So I think what oppression does is to make people feel isolated or to feel they're alone. But I think just knowing we are not alone, at least psychologically, is powerful. The other one would be we need to go back into history, right? One of my criticisms of Gen Z in Kenya would be that they don't know enough of their own revolutionary history, right? So I think we need to go back to history. But generally, for writers and musicians, we have no choice, right? Because we have to respond to the times we are in. So maybe getting our voices together as well as artists and writers and so on and so forth, that would be really helpful. But I would say I think my realization, let me put it that way, is it's a powerful feeling to know you're not alone. Well, in the struggle in that case, yeah.
Indeed, we are the 99%. Thank you very much, Mukoma wa Ngugi, who is an author, a professor at Cornell of English Studies, and a founder of a very important Kiswahili Prize. Thank you very much for joining the ILCP's Israeli Apartheid Week event today.
No, thank you. And I learned a lot as well. So thank you as well for having me. Yeah.
We're very honored. Thank you very much. With that concludes the interview section of today's event. We'll be moving on now to introducing the Lawyers for Palestine Pledge. And my co-host is going to remove Mukoma from the screen so that we can move forward to the pledge. Thank you very much. So the Lawyers for Palestine Pledge is a very important document that will be available on the ILCP's website during the course of the coming week. I'm going to outline this document for you and share why it is important. So in the introduction, as you can see, as legal professionals, we are entrusted with the responsibility to uphold justice, protect human rights, and advocate for the rule of law. The ongoing Israeli occupation and the system of apartheid imposed on the Palestinian people challenge these core principles, calling upon us to stand in solidarity with those whose rights have been systematically violated. The Lawyers for Palestine Pledge is an international initiative that calls on legal professionals, lawyers, judges, scholars, and activists to commit to using their skills, their knowledge, and their influence to support the Palestinian people in their struggle for justice, equality, and self-determination. By signing this pledge, we affirm our dedication to defending human rights and advocating for legal accountability and contributing to the international movement against Israeli apartheid. Our commitment to justice and accountability as signatories of the Lawyers for Palestine Pledge, we commit to A, advocating for Palestinian rights in all legal reforms. And you will see under each of these points, there are subpoints 1, 2, and 3. B, challenging Israeli apartheid. C, providing legal support. D, educating and raising awareness. And E, supporting international solidarity movements. So very specific call to action in this Lawyers Pledge for Palestine. And in the conclusion call to action, the legal profession's responsibility. As lawyers, judges, and legal professionals, we have a moral, ethical, and professional obligation to confront injustice wherever it occurs. The ongoing Israeli occupation and apartheid system not only violates Palestinian rights, but also challenges the very principles upon which international law is built. It is incumbent upon us to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and to use our legal expertise to advocate for justice and equality. This pledge is not a mere statement of support. It is a call to action. By signing the Lawyers for Palestine Pledge, we commit to taking tangible steps to ensure that Palestinian voices are heard in legal forums and that justice is pursued on their behalf. We believe that the law must be a tool for freedom, justice, and peace. We pledge to work towards a future where Palestinians live in freedom, justice, and self-determination, free from occupation and apartheid. And in the signature section, by signing this pledge, I affirm my commitment to the legal defense of Palestinian rights and the pursuit of justice for all those affected by Israeli apartheid. You will be able to sign with your name, your title or profession, your country, and the date. Of course, this pledge represents an international commitment to ensuring that the legal profession plays an active role in advancing justice for Palestine and challenging the apartheid system that denies them their fundamental rights. Let us stand together, united in our legal responsibility to advocate for a world in which human dignity and equality are upheld for all. So we encourage and we ask you to share the Lawyers for Palestine pledge around the world in the legal fraternity, in the activist community, with the artist community, with everyone really, so that people can sign up to the Lawyers for Palestine pledge on the website and show their support. the website, which you would have seen on various posters that we've shared in the run-up to this particular event. If my co-host could please pop that link into the chat. And please look out for that Lawyers for Palestine pledge during the course of this week. It's ilcpal.netlify.app. So that is the website. We're now on to the last part of our event today, ILCP's Israeli Apartheid Week event 2025, the week closing tomorrow. Of course, the work continues. And thank you very much, Mukoma, for sharing your details. There are a number of organizations working in Palestine and social justice in Kenya. That is excellent. In the last part of our event today, we'll be screening a very important film. If you haven't watched it yet, it's going to help you understand exactly what is happening in the US. What's interesting about this film, The Occupation of the American Mind, is that it was created a long time ago. It has been re-released by the Media Education Foundation just after October 7, 2023. In fact, October 25th, 2023. This is the abridged version, 49 minutes. There is a longer version, which is 90 minutes. This film helps to bring context to US corporate media coverage of the October 7th events and Israel's ongoing bombardment of Gaza and, of course, broader Palestine. The documentary places special emphasis on propaganda efforts designed to conceal Israel's brutal and illegal decades-long occupation of Palestinian land as a root cause of the conflict, and to vilify those who speak up for Palestinian human rights as either anti-Semitic or terrorist sympathizers. And it features some well-known names like Noam Chomsky, Rashid Khalidi, Amira Haas, Norman Finkelstein, Phyllis Bennis, Max Blumenthal, Mark Crispin Miller, and so on and so forth. It's narrated by Roger Waters, of course, a very prolific artist for Palestinian freedom. And we encourage you, I will put the link into the chat, and encourage you to share this film with all of your platforms, all of your social networks. It really is that important of a film. So with that being said, let's